I'm Ed. Welcome back to the Filmmakers That Inspire Us. And today, for this episode of Filmmakers That Inspire Us, we'll be taking a look at the life, career, and the legacy so far of the one and only DOP Greig Fraser. Now, if you're not familiar with his work, he's done things like The Batman, Dune Parts 1 and 2, and The Mandalorian and Rogue One. Those are just some of the big spectacles he's worked on. But in this episode of Filmmakers, we will find out how he started in the filmmaking industry and where he is now, and what he's up to in the future. We hope you enjoy this episode of Filmmakers That Inspire Us. Enjoy!
Chapter 1. From Stills to Moving Images. Greig Fraser began his career in Melbourne, Australia, where he developed an interest in photography and media while at school. He later enrolled at RMIT University to study photography, although he famously failed his first year. Despite this little setback, Fraser remained determined to work in the industry and took on jobs such as cleaning floors and doing odd jobs at the local photography and film studio. This allowed him to stay close to a creative environment and gain practical experience while continuing to develop his skills. Fraser's early experiences helped him understand that working in film was about more than just technical knowledge. He eventually joined Exit Films, a Melbourne-based production company, where he became involved in commercial production and met future collaborators, including director Gareth Davis. Working alongside other filmmakers exposed Fraser to the collaborative nature of production, where people could share ideas and build on each other's creativity. During this period, Fraser began shooting music videos and commercials, giving him valuable experience with moving images and different visual styles. He discovered that he preferred the teamwork involved in filmmaking to the more individual nature of still photography. This was an important turning point in his career, as it encouraged him to focus on cinematography and develop his own approach to visual storytelling. Through his work in Australian commercials, music videos and short films, Fraser gradually built a reputation for his distinctive, naturalistic visual style. His early experiences in Melbourne gave him a strong foundation and eventually helped him move into larger productions and Hollywood feature films. These beginnings were important in shaping Fraser into the acclaimed cinematographer he is today. Known for creating atmospheric and visually striking images while working closely with directors and other members of the film crew. Fraser's first feature film was Pins in the year 2000. A documentary directed by Gareth Davis, the film follows 3 Melbourne parking inspectors and gave Fraser the opportunity to work on a feature-length production. This was an important early step in his career and also marked the beginning of his professional relationship with Davis, who would become one of his most frequent collaborators. Fraser then moved further into narrative filmmaking, shooting the short film Cracker Bag in 2003. The film received significant recognition, including an AFI Award nomination for Best Cinematography. This demonstrated Fraser's growing ability to use cinematography to support storytelling and helped enable him as a talented emerging cinematographer in Australian film. His early success led to future opportunities to work with respected directors, including Jane Campion Fraser worked on projects such as The Water Diary, developing his visual style and gaining experience in narrative filmmaking. These collaborations eventually led to his major breakthrough with Campion's Bright Star in 2009, which brought his cinematography to a wider international audience. Bright Star became an important turning point for Fraser, demonstrating that his naturalistic and visually detailed style could work effectively on a larger narrative feature. The success of the film helped Fraser move from Australian short films and documentaries into major international productions, setting him on a path towards the Hollywood projects that would later make him one of the most acclaimed cinematographers working in the industry today.
Chapter 2. Into the Spotlight. Greig worked with director Jane Campion on Bright Star in 2009 following their earlier collaboration on the short film The Water Diary. For the film, Fraser developed a natural, poetic and intimate visual style that suited the emotional story of poet John Keats and Fanny Brawne. Rather than relying on overly dramatic camera work, he used soft, natural light and careful framing. Greig's approach began with understanding the characters and their emotional journeys. He worked closely with Campion during creative discussions, making sure that cinematography supported the story rather than simply focusing on technical camera setups. He also paid close attention to small environment details, including changes in daylight, weather, and the appearance of locations. During pre-production, Fraser used still photography to study these differences and understand how the locations would look under different natural conditions. To keep the audience emotionally connected to the characters, Fraser often used long lenses and fluid camera movements. This created a close and personal feeling while still allowing the film to maintain its poetic beauty. His work on Bright Star demonstrated his ability to create visually striking images without making them feel artificial or overly controlled. The natural and human quality of his cinematography become one of the reasons he attract further attention from major filmmakers and help establish his distinctive visual style. When Greig Fraser shot Zero Dark 30 in 2012, the technology available today such as LED volumes did not exist. To create the extreme contrast between the harsh daylight and almost completely black nights, Fraser and director Catherine Bigelow travelled to Jordan to shoot the film. The final 25 minutes depicting the Navy SEAL raid on Osama bin Laden's compound were particularly challenging because much of the sequence had to be filmed in total near darkness. There was also a lot of pressure for Fraser to use Sony's new f/65 camera because the film was produced by Sony. However, Fraser chose not to use an untested camera in such difficult conditions. Instead, he relied on the classic Arri Alexa, a camera he trusted and knew could perform reliably. Fraser also used large, soft light sources positioned high above the set to create a very subtle starlight effect. The darkness was essential because it created a strong contrast with the green light coming from the SEAL's night vision equipment. Because the scenes were being shot in such extreme darkness, Fraser needed to know immediately whether his images were working. A small digital film lab was secretly established in a nearby hotel room, allowing the team to examine the footage shortly after it was filmed. This was specifically important because digital raw workflows were still relatively new in 2012. The lab gave Fraser the confidence to push the camera in exposure further than he otherwise might have. Fraser's decision to trust his equipment and use the digital lab ultimately paid off, helping him achieve the dark and realistic look that became so important in Zero Dark 30. His willingness to take risks, showing how confident he had become in his approach to cinematography. He had also suggested that without the ability to check the footage, he would probably have worked more safely and predictably. Instead, the combination of careful preparation, trusted technology, and a controlled experimentation allowed him to push the visual style of the film right to the edge. 2 years after Zero Dark 30, Greig Fraser took on Rogue One, a Star Wars story. A standalone prequel to Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope. Unlike the main Star Wars films, Rogue One was given a darker and more serious tone with a greater focus on war, sacrifice, and more moral uncertainty. This gave Fraser, and director of course, Gareth Edwards, more freedom to create a visual style that felt different from your traditional Star Wars film. Fraser was also a lifelong Star Wars fan, making the opportunity particularly important to him. During pre-production, he suggested using, of course, Ari's new camera, the Alexa 65, for the entire film. At the same time, the film was still relatively new and had limitations, including large amounts of data and short recording times. Fraser tested the camera with different lenses and believed that its large sensor could create the scale and detail needed for the film. He also wanted the camera to remain loose and mobile, with handheld shooting becoming the default approach for much of the production. Another important development for Fraser on Rogue One was he used use of LED lighting at the time. LEDs were becoming more and more advanced and could produce a much wider range of colours without relying heavily on traditional gels. Fraser carried out lighting tests alongside his camera tests and discovered that the digital Sputnik LED lights could be used as the main lighting source for the entire film. This gave him greater control over the colour and allowed him to create different atmospheres quickly, while still maintaining his special, natural and realistic quality that had become part of his visual style. Although Rogue One was an expensive production that it required extensive reshoots, it became a major success, earning more than $1 billion worldwide. The use of the Alexa 65 handheld camera work and more LED lighting helped give the film a distinctive look that separated it from the main Star Wars film series. His approach also influenced other cinematographers working on the standalone films, with Bradford Young visiting the set to observe how Fraser was using the new technology and techniques. Chapter 3. Building New Worlds. Greig Fraser is known for having a strong trust in his own visual instincts, but what makes his work particularly interesting to me is his willingness to experiment. His creative eye is combined with free-thinking approach to filmmaking, allowing him to explore new technology and techniques rather than simply establishing methods. This became especially clear through his work on The Mandalorian and Dune Part 1, where he helped push cinematography in very different directions. Fraser had already experimented with large production screens, of course, on Rogue One, particularly involving sequences with X-Wings, the Death Star and the Millennium Falcon. Instead of entirely relying on traditional blue screen techniques and extensive post-production, the projected environments allowed the camera to capture much more in the final image. When Fraser moved on to The Mandalorian, this idea developed into something much more advanced. The production used a huge curved LED volume, displaying digital environments with a game engine, allowing the backgrounds to move in response to the camera. This created realistic parallax, meaning the background appeared to shift naturally as the camera moved. Fraser tested the system with handheld camera movements, and when he found himself visually convinced by the result, he knew the technology could work, and this became a major step forward in virtual production. The LED volume was also became an important part of Fraser's lighting approach. Instead of simply being a background, the enormous screen surrounding the actors became a giant light source, naturally illuminating the characters with colours and atmosphere of the digital environment. This meant that the background, lighting, actors could all exist together in the same space. The Mandalorian therefore became an important test case for the LED virtual production, helping demonstrate how technology could change the filmmaker's approach to visual effects and cinematography. One of Fraser's biggest challenges though on The Mandalorian was not simply making the LED volume look convincing, but making it practical for an entire production. He knew that technology would be useless if every camera setup took too long or required extensive lighting changes. Fraser therefore focused on creating digital environments known as loads. that could be changed quickly and would also provide much of the lighting needed for each scene. This allowed the crew to move efficiently between shots, wide shots, close-ups, and different locations, without constantly rebuilding the lighting for Fraser. The goal was to make technology feel seamless so that the filmmakers and actors could spend more of their time focusing on the performance and story. Fraser also found that the volume gave him an unusual level of control over light, which he saw as one of the greatest creative advantages. Instead of fighting against sunlight or using diffusion and negative fields begin to control natural conditions, he could create the exact same lighting environment he wanted before filming even begun. This was important not only technically but emotionally, as Fraser believed that light has a powerful influence on how audiences feel, which it does. By controlling the light and the environment together, he could create a consistent mood, while also making the production much faster and more flexible. Before production began, Fraser and the team carried out a small test of the volume to prove that technology could actually work. There was a significant pressure because The Mandalorian was part of the Star Wars universe, and Fraser did not want the fact that it was a television series to result in lower visual standards. During the test, the perspective tracking technology worked so convincingly that Fraser became immersed in the digital environment and temporarily forgot he was even standing in an LED studio. The test also demonstrated how different departments could work together in a new way. Visual effects, cinematography, lighting, production design, and the camera department all had to be considered at the same time, creating a much more integrated filmmaking process. And Fraser described the experience as exceeding his expectations, and recognised that the volume could have a major impact on the future of filmmaking, which it did on many other projects. His work on The Mandalorian therefore became more than simply using new technology. It helped establish a new method that could create and that could continue to develop as filmmakers discovered new ways to use visual environments. Dune Part 1, however, required a completely different approach. Rather than relying on LED volumes, Fraser and director Denis Villeneuve travelled to locations such as Jordan to create the vast landscapes of Arrakis. The film was designed on an enormous scale, with IMAX photography helping to emphasise the size and power of the desert environments. Fraser once again embraced experimentation, but this time was focusing on combining a large format digital cinematography with physical landscapes. Villeneuve and Fraser also experimented with the texture of the image itself. They shot using a large digital format camera before transferring the images onto 35mm film and scanning them back into the digital format for the final film. This unusual process allowed them to combine the sharpness and detail of modern cinema with some of the texture and imperfections of associating with film. Rather than choosing between digital and analog, Fraser explored what could happen when the two were combined. Denis Villeneuve wanted Dune Part 1 to feel natural and physically believable. Despite its futuristic setting, rather than using artificial looking cross-lighting on the actors, they relied on strong consistency with the sunlight to create the impression that the characters were genuinely standing in a harsh desert environment. The skies over Arrakis were also deliberately stripped of much of their colour, creating a hot, hazy, almost monochromatic atmosphere. This helped make the planet feel hostile and realistic rather than a traditional science fiction setting. Fraser primarily used the Arri Alexa LF, which provided high levels of detail while also allowing for shallow depth of field. Different lens choices were used to distinguish between the planets and the environments in the story. The contrast between spherical and anamorphic lenses helped give locations their own visual identity, with the lush and wet Caledon feeling very different from the dry and expansive landscapes of Arrakis. These choices would allow the cinematography to communicate the differences between worlds without relying solely on production design. Fraser also wanted to avoid the overly clean and clinical appearance that could sometimes come from modern digital cameras. To achieve a more organic texture, he experimented with transferring the digital footage onto physical 35mm before scanning it back into the digital format. This unusual process, with subtle grain, softness, and imperfections into the image while maintaining the digital format of photography. The result was a visual style that combined modern and old footage together, giving Dune Part 1 a timeless and textured appearance. The work on Mandalorian and Dune Part 1 demonstrates Fraser's ability to adapt his cinematography to completely different filmmaking challenges. On The Mandalorian, he helped explore the possibilities of LED volumes and virtual production, while on Dune he used large format photography, real locations, and experimental imaging processing to create an enormous cinematic world. In both cases, Fraser's willingness to test new ideas and trust his visual instincts allowed him to push cinematography beyond traditional techniques. Chapter 4. Entering the Cinematography Hall of Fame. After Dune Part 1, Greig Fraser took on another major project with Matt Reeves, The Batman. Starring Robert Pattinson as Batman, Zoe Kravitz as Catwoman, and Paul Dano as the Riddler. The film presented a darker and more grounded version of the character, focusing less on traditional superhero spectacle, more on crime, corruption, and the atmosphere of Gotham City. Fraser and Reeves wanted the film to feel gritty, intense, realistic, while still creating images that felt iconic and almost like comic book artwork from the DC Comics. Fraser already had a strong relationship with Matt Reeves, having previously worked with him on Let Me In 2010. Their shared interest in the 1970s cinema became an important influence on the Batman. They looked at films such as Clute and the other work of the cinematographer of Gordon Wills, known for his dramatic use of shadows and darkness rather than copying the looks of the 1970s films. Fraser and Reeves wanted to capture their atmosphere and visual philosophy, creating what Fraser described as an urban noir style. The filmmakers deliberately avoided using previous Batman films as their main visual reference. Instead, they focused on the iconic imagery already associated with the character, such as Batman standing above Gotham at night watching over the city. Fraser wanted these moments to be simple and powerful, creating images that could almost stand alone like comic book panels. This approach allowed Reeves and Fraser to create their own interpretation of Batman, rather than completely trying to copy earlier versions of the character, like with the Dark Knight trilogy. The choice between film and digital was also an important part of the production, but ultimately Reeves decided to shoot digitally using the Arri Alexa LF again. They worked closely with Arri to develop and test lenses that suited the film's visual style. Because of much of the image would later go through the film out process, they wanted lenses that particularly looked sharp in the centre while allowing edges of the image to become softer. This helped create the slightly imperfect quality that they were looking for. Lighting was one of the big challenges because Batman spends so much of the time in the darkness. Fraser studied documentary film photography of cities and wanting the lighting to feel as though it came naturally from Gotham itself. Instead of simply placing a bright backlight behind Batman to reveal his silhouette, Fraser often lit the environment around him. Practical lights, fluorescents, tungsten lights, and modern LEDs fixtures were combined to create realistic sources of illumination. This helped maintain detail in Batman's black suit while keeping him surrounded by darkness. Ultimately, the Batman demonstrated how Fraser could combine advanced digital technology with traditional cinematic influences. The use of large format anamorphic photography, practical lighting, and film out techniques carefully controlled darkness with a gritty visual style for Gotham. Fraser's urban noir approach helped him make the film grounded, contemporary, while still giving Batman the larger-than-life imagery expected from the character. Then, in 2024, Greig Fraser returned once again to Dune, this time for Dune Part 2, once again working with director Denis Villeneuve to create a vast cinematic world. The scale of the production was enormous, with filming taking place across locations including Abu Dhabi and Italy. Despite this, Fraser's approach was not always dependent on complicated equipment or enormous crews. Some scenes were achieved with only a small team working directly in the desert, demonstrating the impressive cinematography can sometimes come from careful planning and the natural environment rather than expensive technology. One of the major differences with Dune Part 2 compared to Dune Part 1 was the use of IMAX formats. The film was designed to work across different aspect ratios, including the very large 1.43.1 IMAX frame and the other 1.90.1 format used in other IMAX presentations. This created a challenge for Fraser and his camera team because compositions had to work across different formats of the image. The filmmakers had to carefully consider where characters and important details were placed within the frame, so the images remained effectively regardless of how audiences experienced the film. Fraser continued to use large format ARRI cameras, including the Alexa 65 and Alexa LF, which I think are some of his favourite cameras of all time, to be honest. Rather than simply chasing the highest possible resolution, his priority was the overall quality and feeling of the image. He also continued experimenting with film out processes again, transferring the digital images before scanning them back into digital workflow. This helped remove some of the clinical sharpness associated with digital cameras and introduced a subtle organic texture. However, different versions of the film meant the final appearance could vary depending on whether audiences watched it digital, IMAX, or the 70mm presentation. The cinematography of Dune Part 2 was also deliberately restrained. Fraser did not want the camera to draw attention to itself when the world of the film was already so visually extraordinary. Instead, the camera often behaved as though it was documenting a real environment, allowing the enormous landscapes, creatures, and production design to provide much of the spectacle. His lens choices included rehoused vintage lenses, Soviet-era glass, and selections from ARRI's Heroes collection, giving the images different textures and imperfections while still maintaining a constant visual language. Natural light played a practical important role in the desert sequences. Some scenes were filmed without artificial lighting, with the crew carefully planning around dawn and dusk to achieve desired quality of sunlight. Backlighting helped separate the characters from the similar coloured sand, while the warm light bouncing naturally from the desert provided additional illumination. This relatively simple approach created images that felt authentic because the environment itself was doing much of the lighting's work. Ultimately, Dune Part 2 shows Fraser continuing the philosophy that has defined much of his career, using technology and experimentation without allowing them to overplay the story. Whether working with IMAX cameras, unusual lenses, film processing, infrared photography, or simple desert light, every technique was chosen to make the world feel unbelievable. The scale of the film production is enormous, but Fraser's cinematography often remains surprisingly simple. Chapter 5: The peak of Greig Fraser's career. And now, Greig Fraser's work on Project Hail Mary, the most recent film. He demonstrated his continued interest in combining advanced technology with realistic filmmaking. Directed by Phil Lord and Christopher Miller and based on Andy Weir's novel, the film follows Ryland Grace, played by Ryan Gosling, as he wakes up in a place alone in space and gradually remembers his mission to save Earth. Fraser's particularly interest in the director's approach because he saw the film not simply as a scientific story but as a human buddy film at its centre. This helped shape his cinematography, as he wanted spectacle space environments to remain grounded in believable human experiences. One of the biggest challenges was making the scientific fiction world feel realistic rather than overly futuristic. Fraser and the filmmakers considered the laws of physics when designing the spacecraft, including the unusual way it travels through space. The ship moves vertically before changing to a horizontal position as it slows down, creating a sense that it has been designed according to the real physical principles rather than typical science fiction conventions. Fraser also wanted the camera to feel human and physically present. often using handheld movement and avoiding impossible camera positions that would make it feel artificial. And of course, a major creative challenge was bringing Rocky, an alien character with no conventional face, to life. Rocky was created using a combination of animatronics, servo motors, and traditional rod puppeteering performed by James Ortiz. This practical approach gave Fraser something physical to photography and allowing him to understand how Rocky would react to light. Rather than making the alien cute or giving him human-like facial features, Fraser used lighting to gradually make Rocky feel warm and approachable. This was particularly important because the audience needs to develop an emotional connection with a character who does not communicate through facial expressions. Lighting was also used to create a natural time of day inside the spacecraft. Fraser developed a lighting system that changed throughout the day, beginning with cooler blue tones in the morning and gradually moving towards warmer colours in the evening, before becoming dimmer at night. This created the feeling of sunrise and sunset, even though the characters were travelling through space. Fraser also designed a complex lighting system for the specific centrifuge, using multiple cream source vortex fixtures to simulate sunlight moving across different windows. The intention was for these changes to feel natural enough that audiences would experience them emotionally without concisely noticing the technique. Fraser also wanted to avoid relying heavily on green screen and blue screens, which he felt could negatively affect lighting and compromise the realism of the image. Instead, the production used blackouts and LED screens for many of the space environments, while Unreal Engine was used to help design and visualize complicated sequences. Fraser also became much involved in visual effects process than he had in previous films, working closely with the VFX team to explore camera angles. This allowed cinematography and visual effects to become part of the same creative process rather than being treated as completely different separate stages of the production. Ultimately, Project Hail Mary continues Fraser's approach of treating technical problems as creative opportunities. Whether he was lighting a practical alien puppet, creating artificial daylight inside a spinning spacecraft, or working with Unreal Engine to design space sequences, he used technology to support the realism of the story rather than distract it from it. His collaboration with Phil Lord and Christopher Miller also allowed him to explore a different kind of scientific sci-fi filmmaking. The results reflect Fraser's broader philosophy that even the most complicated technical challenges can become opportunities to discover new ways of storytelling. Greig Fraser's journey through films such as Bright Star, Zero Dark 30, Rogue One, The Mandalorian, Dune Part 1 and 2, The Batman and Project Hail Mary has established him as one of the most respected cinematographers working today. Although he shot the first two Dune films, unfortunately he will not be returning for Dune Part 3 due to scheduling commitments. Instead, his next major project is with the awesome director Sam Mendes, with the ambitious series of the 4 Beatles films, which each film will focus on a different band member. The Beatles project feels like another exciting challenge for a cinematographer who's continued to push his career throughout his whole life. From smaller Australian productions to huge Hollywood blockbusters, Fraser has constantly experimented with new technology while maintaining a strong focus on storytelling, light and realism, and he's now at the very heights of his career, having worked across some of the biggest and most visually ambitious films of recent years. With such a remarkable career already behind him, the only question left is, what film and what new visual world awaits Greig Fraser next? Thank you so much for watching the Filmmakers That Inspire Us, Greig Fraser. We hope you learn quite a bit about his life and career. He's had such a career so far, and he's only going to go on to do more exciting big things, like with Sam Mendes. I'm so excited for those 4 Beatles films. I'm sure they're going to turn out so well. And he's just got such a natural flair, and he knows how to work with natural lighting and new technologies and old cameras. He knows how to really blend film and digital together, which I just think is impressive. And actually, a fun fact for you guys to end this documentary, he's done an interview on the Team Deakins podcast. Now, if you don't remember, we've covered Roger Deakins in the past, a previous filmmakers, and he's another one of my favourite DOPs, so make sure you go and check that one out as well. But yes, Greig Fraser is probably my all-time favourite DOP. And with all that being said, I've been Ed, Jordan's been Jordan, you've been you, and we'll see you tomorrow. For Alton Towers, goodbye.
Real thrills.